Welcome to Akasha Talks, a podcast on consciousness, healing, and different ways to interact and weave those together, both old and new, to be able to get the most out of your life. I'm your host, Lance Baker, coming to you from Newcastle, Australia. Hope you kick back, relax, and enjoy the show. Welcome, Gabriel Axel Montes. Excited to have you on. I first met you, I think, 3 years ago at a workshop you gave in a yoga studio in Newcastle on neuroscience and meditation. I honestly can't remember huge details of that workshop because it was a one-day thing 3 years ago, but I do remember walking away really excited and I was mentally stimulated. I did a lot of concentration meditation after that, thinking of the different things that you talked about. And I know some of that stuff definitely got integrated. Most of it's probably been just mixed in without me even realizing where it came from. But I had you on my mental list for when I started this idea fairly close to back then that I'd have a podcast. I'd have you on. And I've watched your work evolve and change and tweak since then on the little bits you share here and there online when you're not too engrossed in your actual work. And so I reached out to have you on before we launched, and conflicts of time zones and everything got in the way, and then we finally organised it again. So welcome to finally get here.
Thank you, Lance. It's great to be here.
So do you want to tell us a little bit about your journey through neuroscience, your yogic path, educations, and everything of what builds that unique version of who you are and what you have of your interests and works?
Yeah, sure. I'd be happy to. So today I am basically at a point where I've completed the course and the thesis work for my PhD in neuroscience. And I had done all that at the University of Newcastle in Australia, and that's why we met in Newcastle. And so that took about 4 years or so. And before all that, I was already doing a lot of meditative kind of esoteric work. And the way that started out, we go to the beginning. I would say that I was, if I take just a liberty to kind of reflect on it in a personal way, I feel like I was born a scientist with my heart open. And I had a deep curiosity of the world. I was just telling someone the other day, happenstantially, that my mom said that when I was born, I was just looking around like this, and eyes were open everywhere, looking around. And I feel that since I was young, since as early as I have memories, I can remember in my experience just like a presence of a luminous light quality, just permeating experience. It didn't have anything that I understood at the time, or I don't think I understood it cognitively for a long time. But I'd say when I was 4 or 5 years old, I had this apprehension of something there. I knew there was something. And when I was about 15, I had a spontaneous sort of witnessing / out of body experience while I was on an airplane listening to ambient music. And I was just very relaxed. And I remember there was like this subtle feeling of just, some part of my mind said, just relax even more than you already are listening to this music. Myself from outside of my body. I wasn't not myself. I didn't travel very far or anything, but I just had this feeling like I was something that was more than my localized consciousness. And that experience, came and went. And I thought, well, this is interesting because, I don't know what this means, but it leaves me very curious about the brain, the mind, consciousness, etc. And so throughout my education, I studied biology, and that was my main focus. I think I was most attracted to biology and some biochemistry, and from a perspective of the wonder of life and the wonder of how things organize themselves. And I remember looking at DNA strands in textbooks and thinking to myself, like, how, like, this wonderful curiosity of, like, this is so beautiful, it's elegant. And so time went on, and I went to college, and in my university years, I had some more experiences. I had some experiences using entheogens or psychedelics in my college years. And that kind of, opened my eye at the time. And it helped me to kind of just give me a nudge further into the things I was already interested in. But I quickly thought to myself, well, I don't see myself really repeating these kinds of things a whole lot. I wanted something that I could practice and make it become sustainable in my life practice. And so I started immediately meditating, and I started reading books on Zen Buddhism, and I went to Tibetan Buddhist meditation meetups and led by lamas and things like that. And then that kind of began this process of, in my university, I thought, I have all these classes that I'm doing, and I was doing really well in all my classes, and I thought, what, this is a great education. There'll only be a piece. There's a lot of stuff here that isn't being taught, that I feel that I need to figure out on my own. So I started meditating, and I started doing yoga. I thought, okay, if I'm busy, I'm in a band, I'm doing pre-med because I thought I wanted to be a doctor, and I'm studying and I'm enjoying college life and all that, a social life, and reading things that were not in my curriculum. So I wanted time for everything. And I thought, if I could dedicate 1 hour of every day to having some kind of a practice that works out my physical, my emotional, my mental, psychological, and spiritual aspects of my being, what would I do? And I thought, well, let me do yoga. I was already going to the gym, but I started to do yoga every day. And I started to read some yoga books like Iyengar's material. I started doing yoga on my own. I think I did yoga I had been to one yoga class or two, and then I did yoga on my own for like a whole 2 years without ever going to a class again, and just figuring it out for myself. And then from then on, I felt like I established some kind of a regimen of experiencing my body and things like that. And I got into this rhythm. And at that point I was studying anthropology. Then I swapped to neuroscience at the last minute because I had all these course recs that were aligned. And in my thesis, I wanted to study the effects of the psychedelic substance called salvia divinorum on the mind. So I was really, have you heard of that by any chance?
Yeah, it tweaks the same areas of the brain as LSD, but slightly different. It's like a 15-minute pop in, pop out.
Yeah, so it's a unique thing. And so most people were talking about LSD and psilocybin, which have now, particularly psilocybin, has been shown now at even up to very high tiers of academia. Johns Hopkins just started a psychedelic research center based upon some psilocybin research showing that it had that the quality of life of the people who took it went on very positively for 6 months or more after the single session, the first time they had ever tried it, and that was corroborated by their family members. So at the time, I wanted to do psychedelic research, and I tried to study salvia divinorum, which it hits the kappa opioid receptors, which have to do a lot with dysphoria. So that experience of that plant is one where the bodily boundaries that you have become they disassemble, and you kind of start whatever you perceive. If you perceive like a sofa or a TV or a computer mouse in front of you, you just become that, and it feels like you're living a life. That's what you can experience in the course of 5 minutes, and it could be quite intense, and it could actually be a little bit unpleasant. So it's not exactly something recreational, but due to the not so how do I say it, the not yet ripe understanding of the Western mind of how to relate with these things, people started posting videos online about them, and then all the legislators around the U.S. said, "Oh, well, we can add that to our CVs and resumes, that we passed legislation to outlaw this substance," and it just made research harder. So I abandoned that research, and I did my master. Then I went on to do my master's in the Netherlands in neuroscience and cognition, and I was still interested in consciousness, right? So, but no one there was really studying mindfulness yet. No one was studying psychedelics. There was still that psychedelic dark age taboo. So when I was doing my studies, I had wanted to study this because I thought it was an easy entryway into all that, and it just didn't work out. And now that I finished my studies, now there's a psychedelic renaissance. Now, what's interesting is that it just didn't seem that my life progressed in a way that those opportunities became my path, right? I didn't become a psychedelic researcher. And in a way, I accept that, and I'm kind of happy for it, because it turned out that in my self-cultivation spiritual journey, I realized that at some point that psychedelics were like just a peak of abilities of experience that somebody could have. That basically psychedelics are really good eye-openers that can help people with PTSD and trauma, potentially under the right setting, of course, work through some of the stuff that they have going on. And for many people, it's an eye-opener. But alone as a path, it just didn't feel for me to be, it didn't meet my deeper desires. I really wanted to go all the way, and to really, really go deep. So after I finished my master's, I ended up studying the genetics of schizophrenia and autism, nothing to do with the consciousness stuff. Genetics of schizophrenia and autism, and basically translational psychiatry. I still had that interest in molecules of substances, but psychiatric drugs at that point, and how they translate to genetic targets, things like that. The genetics, the transcriptome, genes create these transcript RNAs that code for proteins. And I was working on understanding this one called FOXP2, which is one of the genes implicated in language, the capacity for language. But language was also of interest to me because it felt like a fundamental or human question about who we are at a deep level. In the end of all that, I felt, you know what? I had continued my yoga practice for all that time. I felt that I needed to know about consciousness in a deeper way than what I was doing. That wasn't only in the laboratory. And the laboratory setting was just, was great. It was great pipetting DNA in a laboratory, but that wasn't teaching me about consciousness. I thought that we were just kind of trying to solve elusive problems, autism, schizophrenia, things that are long-term games and are very complex. And it's great that we're doing research on them, but I thought I want to do something a little bit that also includes my own inner world. So after my my master's degree was over, while I was looking for my next step in my career as a neuroscientist, I also felt the strong intuition to undertake some kind of a more formal study in consciousness studies of some sort. And so I kind of did a very, the thing that's for many people, which is you do like a yoga teacher training. So I did a yoga teacher training at a one particular place that I felt really resonant at the time. And it opened up a whole lot many more things for me. And that I basically created my own personal yoga university. I just did full-time yoga studies. When I wasn't doing yoga class, I was reading the texts. I was, going deeper. Then I found a group that was connected to a yogi that was from the Himalayas, and an Indian, very old yogi, and it was an interesting time. I spent some time there, and I realized as well that I started learning a lot of lessons about spirituality. So that whole phase was like spirituality 1.0 for me, where I was adopting the lifestyle. I was, there was a teacher like this, a particular guru, and I was doing yoga asana, all these things that are kind of like just preparing, tuning the engine. And at some point I realized that not just cognitively, but, I could feel it energetically, that some people have their own agendas, and they restrict the sovereignty of the practitioner. And it evades most people, because the spiritual practitioner is someone who has qualities of open-mindedness, but also self-effacement. Because we go into spirituality, a lot of us, to be out of an existential motivation. Like there's something that we want to get towards, that we recognize, but part of the drive isn't only a pull from what's ahead of us, like, so to speak. It's also a push of, like, basically aversion to life traumas and circumstances. So what can happen is that a lot of the things that push us aren't actually resolved, and we end up filling those, like, fill a needy hole with another nail, but it just looks like a spiritual golden nail, So that starts happening, and it took me a while to realize that was happening. So I started kind of developing some more maturity on the path, so to speak. And I left that establishment, and I started pursuing a more sovereign path. And around that time, I met a couple of basically more deeply adept yogis that were very much in the world, very much present here and now, integrated in society, but also deeply knowledgeable and advanced, almost in a genius manner. And I found the people that I really resonated with, and that person, and a couple of other individuals, I started learning tantric hatha yoga from them. And did you want me to repeat that in case the dog barking got in the way?
No, Tantra Hatha Yoga. It was still clear.
It was still clear?
Yes.
Okay, no worries. So I met a couple of individuals who were very adept at Tantric Hatha Yoga, and much deeper aspects of yoga than just only asana. And I went and studied fervently with them, basically just trying to understand as much as I could, and testing everything for myself to see what worked and what didn't work for me. And that's when I started going down a more esoteric rabbit hole, and I started getting more sensitive energetically. And during this time, I took I enrolled in a curriculum called CAP, Kundalini Awakening Process. This was back in 2010 or 11. And this was nothing to do with Kundalini yoga, but it was basically a system that is designed to awaken the neuroendocrine potentials of your body and your system to be able to process more signal bandwidth. And so that whole system has a process, which is the awakening of this electrical or bubbly energy inside the body that starts then awakening these nerve plexuses. And when those awaken, so to speak, what that means is that your perception in consciousness starts to change, and you can start to reach more and more the core of experience, the bliss and the emptiness that's at the center of all experience. And so that happens as the Kundalini process progresses, and we can talk a little bit more about that. So I went through that process, and as soon as I had integrated that within myself, I was able to teach in the method, and that's part of what I do today. Is I integrate that, my neuroscience background with those kinds of perspectives that include basically looking at the process of awakening and what some people will call enlightenment from the biological perspective. And so I did CAP, and I spent 4 years outside of basically like a mainstream sort of neuroscience path. And then I decided at some point to go back and do my PhD. And the PhD came about basically with this opportunity to get a position in Australia. So I moved to Australia and did my doctorate there. And it started off looking at stroke patients, but it turns out that when you're doing research, it's pretty challenging to work with patients and participants because you have to organize them, and it can be a little bit like cat herding. And especially if you're doing a medical intervention, you have to seek approval, like ethical approval, and then stroke patients are already strained in their day-to-day existence. So it turned out that with my academic circuits of world traveling and presenting in different places, and the limited time of a PhD, that doing an empirical study with patients, like a clinical nature, turned out to be it didn't work out time-wise and logistics. So I shifted my focus to cognitive neuroscience and bodily subconsciousness, which is basically, and we can go into this more as well because there's a lot to unpack, but it's basically the sense that I am located in my body and that my body belongs to me and that myself is here. Myself is this, and my body is part of who I am and myself. And then from there, the sense of agency that develops from that. Like, what can I do? If this is what I am, what am I capable of doing? So I started with that. I looked at all the mindfulness and meditation literature, and I realized that there's some seriously important stuff that's missing. That mindfulness meditation is basically like a reduction of a boiled down reduction of the vast cornucopia of knowledge that is in the Eastern traditions. And it's just what we could accept, what our paradigm and our zeitgeist could accept, in the late 20th century and now in the 21st century, is mindfulness. And it helps a lot of people. Having said that, there's a lot more within meditation that mindfulness itself just doesn't quite capture. And mindfulness is still very much like oriented around the sense of self and the self located here and whatnot. And it inherently doesn't reveal certain things like that deeper forms of meditation or alternative forms of meditation can. And so I realized mindfulness is a really good starting point, but we need to go further, and I still maintain that today. I believe that mindfulness is in society with our recognition dynamics, but there's a lot more ground to cover. And so I started looking into all that, and then around this time, I started noticing, before my PhD, I had started noticing that all the body-mind practices I was doing, whether it was yoga asana, internal meditation, internal martial arts, Neigong, Qigong, Tai Chi, mantra meditations, yantra meditations, basically all forms of practice engaged with reality, which is in a sense what Tantra is about. It's like, really expanding your experience. And you'll find that there's practice techniques you could do in any form of experience. I started seeing that all of that had certain key components to it. And when I got to my PhD and I started doing deep literature reviews and looking at what was already out there, I realized that this thing that I had thought about intuitively and kept in the back of my mind with no intention of formally studying it actually matched what I was finding, except it wasn't exactly covered in the literature per se. So I made it explicit, and I wrote about it in my dissertation, and I called it the neural active framework. And basically there are 6 components that make the kind of the process, or the different components that the brain uses to work through everyday reality. Whether you're in body mind practice, which is where I originally started noticing it, because you're proceduralizing stuff in body mind practice. So you start working with your mind in a very hands-on way. Whereas if you're just kind of coursing through life through your errands in the day, you don't necessarily pay too much attention, a priori to the way your mind is operating. But having the body-mind background and then going into the brain and the way it works, I started noticing that there's a lot of similarities. So the neural active framework was born, and then that's something that I've seen is a way of bridging first-person experience with neuroscience. So phenomenology, which is what occurs in your first-person emergent experience, with what's going on in your brain. So then my PhD took a next step, which was all this bodily self-consciousness stuff. I realized that it had a lot to do with the way that our minds formed early on in hominin evolution when we were making tools. So then I came up with a theory called causal biomimesis, which basically shows that because when we make tools, we're also fashioning our sense of self, our bodily self, our sense of agency, what we can and what we can't do, our social identity. That every time we make a tool, we're fashioning ourselves. And when we make a tool, because it involves like a proto-scientific method of, like making a hypothesis, testing it, and then producing a result and then corroborating it, we're actually externalizing the mind in the form of artifacts. So the world that you see around us, everything from the buildings to the clothing we wear to the computers to the artworks that we see around us, starting from the simplest of tools that hominins created, that's all part of the extended mind. And the mind isn't only here, but what is here is something that looks at the world out there dualistically. And when we do that and we try to understand and fulfill consciousness, we start trying to look for wholeness out there. And what we're doing is actually creating duality. But duality is actually a pretext. In a species that is making tools and building things, because the only thing we do isn't just sit there and reflect, but we're also acting in the world and solving problems. So through praxis, we're solving problems, creating tools. And with duality, what we're doing is post-biologically reproducing ourselves. It's like a non-biological form of reproduction coming through this whole region here, our cognition, our third eye, the psychical areas. We're creating basically externalized versions of our mind. So every time we put a tool out there, we no longer have to think about basically the process that created that tool. We're like representing it out there. The same way when you have a phone in your hand, there are certain things you don't need to think about anymore because you just have Wikipedia. Right?
As a species, we're getting smarter and dumber at the same time because we're leaving a lot out. When I was at school, we got told, well, you need to know this because you're not going to always have a calculator in your pocket. We now always do have a calculator in our pocket, plus an encyclopedia. The world experts at anything is right there. Elon Musk calls us that we're already androids because we have separated part of our consciousness to that we just leave that brain space now to look it up. And right. I like you were saying there, it's pretty much like we've created something and we're seeing it as two separate circles, but really it's like an infinity thing. It is connected, it interweaves, which I guess kind of goes back to that early part of your career with the Salvia Divinorum, that it had, that drug creates that animus view that you realize there is consciousness in the land and other things around you. So what we create holds a consciousness of that moment when we tried to work out what this thing was we were thinking and feeling, create something to hold that energy that, yeah.
Yeah. It's an interesting connection. Yeah, it goes all the way back. I haven't done psychedelics in years, but a lot of those early experiences were they foretold, in a sense, some of the things that would expand and develop even further and more deeply later. And so this whole thing that was happening now with externalization, what's been happening since we were using tools. The thing is since our sense of self is so wrapped up in our tool making, because it's bi-directional, tools to self to tools, eventually we're going to externalize ourselves so completely that it's going to look like a version of ourselves, like an advanced AI. And once we have quantum computers, and that develops, along its own timeline, we'll eventually be able to say, well, yeah, we've replicated the human brain, in a sense, out there in this computer. And a lot of it is because of this process where we think, oh, we need to understand the brain, so let's gather data about it. And then we get more complex computers and more data, more complex computers, more data, ratcheting up. And then you just end up creating this thing out there. But it's all this, it's driven by basically techno-determinism, that we just need to adopt the latest technological fix, and also a deep curiosity to understand who we are, right? So if we just maybe paused and thought we don't need a technological fix for everything, that we can actually reflect on ourselves and find that wholeness before we go out and try to create it out there. Not that there's inherently anything wrong with just copying ourselves in some form. But the big problem is that, as you said, we're getting, in one sense, smarter and dumber, because we not use calculators before we had phones, but kids are now being born with iPads in their hands, basically from being really young. And so that's going to make a very big difference on the brain. So that our creation, our advanced AIs, are going to have a reverse direction on us to let us know, like, especially when the AI is made to be human-like and interact with us, it's going to reflect back at us the image that we created the AI in, because the AI is created in our image of ourselves. Like, whoever creates the AI, the engineers and the big picture, is creating AI in an image of our current understanding of ourselves. But if we don't understand ourselves to be beings with deep spiritual, emotional, intuitive capacities, all the things that are hidden in the world's wisdom traditions, then we're creating a very limited version of ourselves. But if that limited version of ourselves in that big picture AI out there is then influencing us, it could actually be making us dumber to think that thing is the real capacity of who we are, especially if that AI can process things that we can't process that fast, which they already can. But the problem is that it could atrophy our understanding of ourselves if the world grows more and more technologically saturated with AI. So part of my work ended up being about that, and I didn't expect it to go that direction. So then I took an AI ethics approach, and then like for an AI and a human mind to merge together. And then I looked at a non-dual consciousness and I broke down non-dual awareness in phenomenologically, based on experience, how that could potentially be translated into the foundations, the conceptual foundations that then would be used to engineer advanced AI. So on the one hand, what we've been creating is maybe making us dumber, but we have this time window really where we need to be creating AI that can reflect our deeper capacities, not just mathematical, logical, rational, cold calculation. We need AI that can really understand what it is to be human, so it can help us reach our full potential, in a sense. So that was the course of my PhD, and now I continue to do research in virtual reality technology to cultivate advanced, non-ordinary consciousness, working on creating beneficial AI, that's beneficial for human consciousness and a big picture future, and other things that are related on the side, and the causal biomimesis hypothesis, because I believe that's important to understand that we're creating AI in our image and we need to improve our image. So AI is actually human intelligence matter. And that's one extra reason why people that are really into technology in the big picture, that necessarily don't find a calling towards mindfulness, to realize that we actually have these capacities in us that are latent, and we need to unearth them and recognize and cultivate and research and implement some non-ordinary consciousness practice that are in there. Those are treasure troves for studying those things in a practical, scientific way, or just, learning from them. But they're hidden in language, in this mythic language from the era and the traditions in which those things were developed. So it takes people that can recognize that stuff to start parsing it out. And that's another reason we need to, I think, use our mindfulness as a foundation and then keep going. Start exploring other things like mantras and understanding what that is about and what that's doing. Awaken our nervous system electrically and see what that can help us to realize and what effect that has on life. Not just to become a better yogi, but to become someone who is in more sovereign control of their reality. And by control, I don't mean fear-based control, like I must control something that I can't control, but being able to manage, read, intuit better, so your people's responses can be more beneficial for the greater good. So,
well, I know the whole track of my life changed drastically once I started meditating and having that introverted perspective to see what was going on inside, to notice the different voices that were my consciousness and what was actually me, what was actually my environment that I was just absorbing when I was on autopilot and just getting distracted by the busy of life that you don't notice. You're just stuck on a railway track going somewhere, but you can get off. And with meditation, it helps you get the map out and work out where you're going to be able to either explore life and find something new or pick a direction and actually flow down that pathway and work out when you're on autopilot and when you're actually creating life rather than just being wrapped up in the flow of it.
Right. And you know that very well with your own journey through self-healing and hypnosis, and you understand that there's subconscious and unconscious programming that affects our life in a very deep way. And that incidentally, not through hypnosis per se, but some of that principle was also part of my research, basically, that all our past information kind of fills up our brain and tunes it in a way that conditions it to predict the present and the future according to the past and what we learned from the past. And whenever that there's a mismatch between that, we either try to forcefully write over the present to fit our old view onto it. So we leave out parts of reality that don't conform to our existing or older views, unconscious and conscious, or we can stop and change our perception. But that's really hard. You have to stop and see, well, maybe this isn't quite working out for me. Maybe my programs are leading me to go in a certain direction. And so hypnosis is potentially, with the right methods, a really great tool for going deep and tweaking. I've had, people come up to me and like went from being a 2-pack a day, 1-pack a day cigarette smoker to being a cold turkey quitting with absolutely no problems through just one hypnosis session. And there's many stories like that. The mind is full of mysteries, but a lot of those methods, I think a lot of people don't reach the mainstream, in part because science as an institution takes some time to, prove things and put them into a mainstream establishment. But I like to approach that. Some people ask me, how do you reconcile science and your spiritual, essence? And I'm like, well, first of all, you don't have to reconcile them necessarily. You could just allow them to both exist, and you can allow a part of you that's deeply curious and deeply open to mystery exist, and then do self-science, so to speak, which is, you experiment something on yourself, you see the basis and you see the result. And if it works for you, great. If it doesn't work for you, well, maybe try it again. Maybe it just didn't work the first time, or leave it aside and then try it in a different way. But remaining open, but also remaining with a healthy sense of skepticism, the same thing that applies.
That's real science, is having a healthy skepticism. Most scientists these days leave that bit out, and they have their belief is the opposite of skepticism. They're a believer of the non-belief in a spiritual thing. They've created their own religion.
Exactly.
And so my view of real science is just having an open-minded experiment, looking for data, and then seeing if you can repeat that with somebody else, and repeat it again with somebody else, and repeat it again with somebody else. If you can repeat it multiple times and get similar results,
right,
then it's something.
Exactly. Yeah. So, the scientific, everyone can be a scientist if we think of science not so much as an institution, but as a method. So, yes, it is an institution, right? That's what produces these randomized controlled trials that tell us different things, but then inform medical practice and clinical guidelines, which is useful for the big scale, maybe, in many ways it is. But everyone can be a scientist in terms of applying the scientific method. You try something with an open mind and you see how it works. Also, the more sensitive one develops their nervous system, the more that one can perceive things before they become a serious problem. And I've noticed that a lot with a lot of the practices I've done, whether it's mantra or qigong or things involved in CAP, the Kundalini awakening process, that becoming more sensitive allows you to pick up on things that are inharmonious or activities that produce imbalance. You can pick up on that, and then you can say, well, okay, if I'm going to do this, then let me do a counterbalancing activity later. Or let me at least realize that this activity is. Whereas if you don't have that body-mind sensitivity, which comes about through cultivation, qigong and breathing and placing your mental awareness in and through your body, as well as your etheric body, to understand your energy flows more broadly, not just the physical metabolic flows, then you can start to make changes that you really need, and that gives you, that helps to prevent you from waiting till something becomes a clinical symptom to deal with it, which then becomes really expensive. So this is part of the idea of becoming anti-fragile. Like, you might lift weights a lot and have a weightlifting regimen. You might think, well, what's the use of that? But it prepares you for the event that's a black swan event, that you might actually have to lift a car to get someone from out of it, or lift a piano up the stairs, or any kind of example. And in the meantime, you get endorphins, which help you to deal with the small stresses much better, because evolutionarily, and adaptationally, you're signaling your body and your mind that you're lifting weights, which means that you're dealing with bigger stressors. So you're going to release endorphins, which will help you to deal with the small stressors better. So cultivating your mind and body like that starts to have multitudinous effects. So we can go into one of the things that I did in my research, which is bodily self-consciousness. Bodily self-consciousness is the sense that I'm located here, and this is my body. You can alter this in certain experiments. If you look up the rubber hand illusion online.
Yeah. I've been planning on remaking that because it blows my mind.
Yeah. So that was more or less the experimental focus aspect of my research. And basically, the rubber hand illusion is, as you know, but for everyone listening, it's, you have your real hand occluded from view with like a shawl covering your shoulder, and then you have a fake hand, like a prosthetic hand, just to the inside of your hand. And then someone occluded from view, like an experimenter or a friend in front of you, is stroking with a brush your real hand, which you cannot see, and the rubber hand simultaneously. And within seconds or within minutes, depending on the person and the time and place, you will start to feel like the rubber hand is yours. Your body and your mind start to basically work out something computationally that makes you feel that your rubber hand is yours, right? Mm. So then you can, the person can come along and take a hammer and hit the rubber hand, and you actually pull your real hand, which is off to the side. It's not being, it's not an imminent threat of being struck by the hammer. You'll pull it out, and, then you'll have this realization, So it basically shows that this experiment shows that bodily self-consciousness, your sense of bodily ownership, is malleable.
I've seen another variation of that with ice, where they blindfold somebody and they put ice on their hand, but somebody lights a match at that time. And the people freak out, feeling a burn rather than feeling a freeze, because the auditory sense of that match overwrites the feeling of cold, and their consciousness creates heat instead of the actual physicality of the cold that's there.
Right. Yeah, there's all these little tricks that have to do with perception, and those are called priors, which is like your prior perceptions or prior expectations. And if the rubber hand illusion plays a lot with, your expectation, but it turns out that, the way your body treats a sense of location is quite flexible. If you're in sense of interoception, or bodily awareness isn't cultivated regularly, you might be more susceptible to the illusion, potentially. So someone tried the illusion on me, and I couldn't, it didn't happen to me. I was looking at it, but that was because I believe I have been doing so much body-mind cultivation that I know exactly where my body is, But then what I did was I instantly activated myself to just let my attention relax and allow myself to be hypnotized. I sort of willed it, said, okay, just relax your attention. And in that moment, I felt the rubber hand to be kind of part of my body. And then, I realized that, you can have a very solid sense of bodily ownership, whereas you know exactly where your boundaries are, or it could be a little bit looser. So this kind of research has been related to anorexia, for example. So maybe people with anorexia, they look at an ad of a model, and they identify more with that, and they lose sense of their body more easily. So yeah, it's good to have some mix of both. So the bodily self-consciousness, right? The reason that we believe our sense of self is here is because all our senses come in here, into our body, and even our head more specifically. So throughout evolution, over many generations, over thousands of years, and more, we have trained ourselves to be aware of our 3D, 4D reality. In yogic terms, that's like our root chakra, right? It's like our
connection,
our self-protection, survival. And so we have trained ourselves in this lifetime to and throughout our ancestral, lifetimes, which gets transferred in some sense, to be able to place primary importance on our physical body. And so it's pretty hard to think of ourselves as anything other than physical, because we're so used to relating to this. But the very reason why that we think our sense of self is located here in our body. So you have the body and you have the self. The reason why we think our sense of identity and self is located in the body, and they're so closely tethered together, is because our senses converge here. So your brain optimizes for that and says, well, we can make sense of reality better if we combine multiple sources of information. So our sight, our hearing, our smell, our touch, and so on. Our proprioception, our interoception, our stomach pains, I'm hungry, sex drives, all that stuff. And it makes sense of it and says, okay, I'm located here. Allocate most resources here. But non-ordinary consciousness research, near-death experiences, Soviet divinorum, if you want to include that, teaches us, in a sense, that the bodily self is very malleable, and the sense of self is actually has no real volume to it. Like you could say, tell me the volume of the brain, but if I tell you, tell me the volume of the mind, you can't quite do it. It's kind of like the three-dimensional Newtonian way of looking at volume doesn't hold up there. It becomes something like having models. Okay, maybe the mind, in terms of the body, has a volume, but if you look at the mind in terms of feeling, and you analyze the volume of that, and we loosen the definition of volume, it's actually beyond our body. It's kind of like we can feel things beyond our body. And then if you think about the volume of the mind in terms of our memories, it becomes like we have these little tunnels in our mind that link up to different time spaces. And if you look at the volume of the mind in terms of our relationship with nature and our feelings evoked by nature, the volume of the mind there isn't anywhere near physically contoured to the body. It's actually incredibly vast and extended way out. And then when you talk about concepts like, ancestral lives, those are like deep, deep memories. And that, when you look at pay attention to attention when you're thinking about those things, those give you a sense of the way that feels in your mind and your perception when you think about those things. That's like the virtual volume of the mind. And everything looks different. It's like a three-dimensional or even hyperdimensional blob. So when you pay attention to a memory, it feels a certain way, and your awareness encloses that memory and you're focused on it. If I say, do an open focus meditation where you're not focused on anything, you can get a sense of how everything's just open and you're just aware of as many things as possible. And so on and so forth. So bodily self-consciousness, if you look at non-ordinary consciousness practices, like, body-mind practices, as ways of manipulating and enhancing or facilitating changes in bodily self-consciousness or body ownership, then it gets really interesting, because all of a sudden you can think, well, okay, so if I do a mantra and I think about a particular image, a form, maybe a deity, right? Let's take something really far out, like a deity, like Ganesh or something. Ganesh is this elephant-headed god in Hinduism that has certain properties. Well, that's an anthropomorphized principle that comes secondary to the mantra, which the mantra comes from the intentional evolutionary idea. It's not even an idea at that point. It's just like an energized form of what this principle is. The last thing to come out is anthropomorphized, because that image is filtered through the lens of embodiment. But before that, you have sound. So if you go into your body and you do, let's say, the seed sound for Ganesh, which is gum. Mantra is essentially a sound event, a physical event in the body, and more broadly, a physical event in consciousness. So if you go into the sound and you meditate on it, and you go into the origin of time-space, like imagine yourself at the center of time-space and let a volumetric, hypervolumetric reality. Gum will produce a quality of consciousness that produces qualities that are then attributed to this elephant god. And so when you are producing a sound, you're creating like a hypergeometric reality and consciousness that basically, if we want to put it in really simple terms, is like a virtual body. It's like a body that's not physical, but it is virtual. It's like an etheric body that emerges out of just awareness. And you could call it your imagination, but you can learn to embody this through different layers of your body and feel that this deity principle has certain properties that feel a particular way. And the way Ganesh feels is going to be very different than the way Hanuman feels and the way Kali feels. And if all those are just ideas to someone, all that person needs to do is do the mantra and get into it. So that's part of what I've done a lot of, and part of what I teach is how to look at mantra in that way and how to start paying attention and how to cultivate that. Because right now we think of gods as just this arbitrary thing, but gods are just basically things that we worship, which means things we pay attention to and venerate because they're associated with qualities we want to cultivate. So you can make money your god, you can make vegan raw food diet your god, you can make AI your god, you can make anything you want. So religion has never stopped existing, as you were kind of saying with science. Even science is religious in some sense, and our public institutions today are things that we sublimate ourselves into. So you worship what you want to become more of. The idea is to not make it dogmatic and kind of like narrow-minded, where you start to think, well, that image, and if I just look at that image and I hold the stick and I just meditate on it and I just say how much I love Ganesh, it's going to make a difference in my life. Well, no, ultimately you have to embody those qualities to make it anything more than just an idea. So,
yeah. Well, you did a really interesting experiment with something like this a few years ago that I'd love to hear more about. You did 1,080 mantras a day for Saturn for 200 days.
Yeah.
To connect in with that planetary energy. Would you mind telling us about that experience of how that felt over that 200 days to align yourself with Saturn's energy and how that showed up and manifested throughout your life?
Yeah. So I think I've always been fascinated by astronomy. Since I was a kid, my attention was naturally drawn to certain planets, and one of those was Saturn. And little things like that are intuitive. And one of the things that scientists say is, well, we don't need religion. You just basically marvel at the wonders of the universe, which is actually totally true. You can just marvel at the fact that we're all suspended in this solar system within a galaxy, within a universe, among many galaxies, and that in of itself could just make you explode with a cosmic orgasm of bliss. But just thinking about it is just one idea, and then translating that to actual joy and bliss is another. But then if we take it further and we say, well, consciousness is not located in the body, it's located everywhere. It's totally conceivable that because the sun influences us here on Earth, and the moon does, and we know that influences the tides, it influences how fast certain vegetables grow, it influences, crime rates and all sorts of things like that. So we look at that and we say, okay, I'm going to put aside what we think we know about scientifically about the astronomical system around us. Put aside what we think we know and use my sort of a intuitive judgment and say, it's probably likely that these things are influencing us in some way. So I want to know how they might be. Do we have any model that tells us how they are scientifically in modern science? No, we don't. So I'm not going to wait for that. Me personally, I'm interested in doing an experiment to see what that will be like. So what is the experience of Saturn on consciousness? So we have to that is a mantra, right? So mantras in general are basically codes for reality. They're like physical events, and Sanskrit is an onomatopoeic language. So every phoneme in Sanskrit, just like in ancient Egyptian, Tibetan, and some other in like Hebrew, all these languages are onomatopoeic, and they code for some feeling, right? So I started to do the Saturn mantra, and every planet has a mantra. And even there's a couple of aspects in Vedic cosmology where there's even planets that are not visible in the solar system. Rahu and Ketu, for example, which represent north node and south node of the moon. And that has more to do with the mind and other things. So I decided to do Saturn, and I did 200,000, and I still do it from time to time, even as needed. But I decided at that point to do it as an experiment, just machine gun through the mantras. I did about 1,000 every day or more. And I probably surpassed 200,000 by now. I'm not counting anymore. But I did 200,000 because that's what traditionally has been said gives you mantra siddhi, SIDDHI, which means you attain mastery. I wasn't expecting to master whatever that means. To me, what is a master but a master student? That's the way I look at it. So I wasn't expecting to master anything, just get a deep knowledge of it. So every day I did this mantra, and it's a harmonizing mantra. There's various types of ways to do mantras for planets. There's various types. They're online, depending on what you want to do. You do a harmonizing mantra, a Shakti mantra, which attracts the energy to you, or just a veneration mantra. So, and then there's ways to modify each mantra to make it more in the periphery of awareness versus in your central channel. So I did this mantra, and what I noticed was that this kind of heavy feeling of kicking up dirt in my consciousness. I started to feel feelings of things that had happened to me, that could happen to me based upon my actions, basically the consequences of actions and the implications of them within myself and socially, and also basically like this feeling of things that I had done wrong to other people, or people had done things to me. And Saturn is actually the in Vedic cosmology, the planet that governs karma, which is actually means action and, cause and effect, specifically. And so the bijas, or the seed mantras within the Saturn mantra, felt like they were kicking up things, and the onomatopoeia of it suggests that that's what it might do. So I went through it, and I kept digging, and I had a lot of different kinds of emotions coming up, things that weren't even immediately present in my reality with what was around me. It was contemplative. I was going deep into things that maybe were connected to old parts of me, future parts of me, so to speak.
Well, so Saturn's also ancestral as well. So did you notice stuff come up, since you were talking about ancestral things before?
Yeah. There was these feelings that I felt were deeply familiar to me, but had a resonance that was older than who I was. Like if you're in your own life and you ask yourself, and someone asks you, well, when did this thing start for you? When did you start feeling this way? You can say your earliest memories of something, but your preternatural tendency to react to something, and the base emotions and the kinds of things that trigger those emotions, sometimes you can say, well, my parents did this to me when I was 5 years old or 6 years old, and that's when it all started. Well, I would suggest an alternative interpretation of that, which is that when you're a child, you might react more histrionically to something, and there's a beginning of your memory formation and your self-formation, so you remember that. But a lot of things you can't trace an origin to, that you're just that way and you don't know why. But you grow up and you're a teenager, your parents tell you, oh, your uncle was like this, your grandmother was like that, and your great-grandfather had this thing. And you start realizing that there's something similar between you and people that you heard about in your ancestral history. And when things that started coming up for me were things that I also felt were playing out in the constellation of my family, and my even some of the ancestors and the stories I had heard. Now, a rational scientist, or a diehard dogmatic skeptic, would say, well, that's just a feeling and it doesn't mean anything. But it's like, you need to orient your reality according to the things that you know. It's okay to doubt things, but not to doubt it at the very roots. You have to start with something. So you orient your reality according to what you know, and it's great to start that way. And a lot of those emotions that you experience are experienced in many people. It's just about relating into it from the trunk of your own tree, because that's where you could do all the healing from the feeling of proximity. Like what's What's going on with you and your family? You know, why is it that you live a very happy life, but every time you go home for Christmas or your family holiday, that's when all the shit hits the fan, you know? And that's because our family has that densest karma. That's where we have our densest karma. So if that's going to keep facing you, practically speaking, you want to be able to deal with it. So yeah, ancestral, as you mentioned, karmic, and in the solar system, you know, even there's not just astrologically, so to speak, or an energetic astronomy, which is what astrology is actually. It's like energetic astronomy. But in modern astronomy, there's a really interesting study that came out like 5 or 6 years ago from Caltech, where they developed a model about the formation of the solar system, where basically there were all these little planetoids between the sun and Jupiter and Saturn, which were out there. And Jupiter got pulled in towards the sun and started destroying all the planets around, you know, and kind of crashing into them and remolding them. So basically, the planets that we have now today between the sun and Jupiter and Saturn are nothing like what they used to be before this all happened. I can't remember how long ago this happened, but it was, you know, a number with many zeros behind it. And Jupiter came in, and Jupiter in Sanskrit cosmology is the guru planet, you know, which is interesting given this modern scientific account of it. Jupiter came in and started smashing all these planets, and he was going to get eaten by the sun. But Saturn was in such a dance of frequency of kind of, you know, this rotational harmony, that it sort of followed Jupiter in and sort of pulled it out from getting eaten up. So Jupiter knocked a few planets around and then got stabilized by Saturn. So it's kind of like Saturn had this profound cause and effect on the solar system as it exists today. And in a sense, you could say, like, you know, Jupiter owes Saturn. That's kind of like my cartoon kid version of talking about it and memorizing it. You know, kid stories are a great way of memorizing simple things. So I cartoonify it for myself, but that is an actual model that was created at Caltech some years ago. But, you know, I digress. So the mantra practice that I did with Saturn can be done with any other planet as well. And so now I feel like the results, if you want to ask the results of the self-science approach here of doing the mantra sadhana or practice, I would say that now if I just start doing the Saturn mantra, the experience is much more readily available. I know the signature in a very deep way. Like I know I could just kind of tune in and harmonize that experience right away, you know, for that day, for example. And familiar with my own karmic constitution, my karmic body, so to speak, much better than I was before. And there was some point in that time period where I was doing that 1,000 a day, where I was doing like 100, maybe, or 1,000 on some days of all the other planets. And that was interesting. And curiously, if you cultivate enough, there's some interesting associations between the planets, their energies, including the sun and the moon, and the external Taoism and traditional Chinese medicine, of which there are 8. And they govern bilateral animals on planet Earth. So you have basically certain channels. You have the central channel. You have the which is called the Chong Mai, the frontal, which is Ren Mai, then the back channel, which is Du Mai, the governing vessel, and then you have the Yang Wei and the Dai Mai. I think I said all 8 there. And so there's planetary associations with each of these. And so our solar system, this actually has some potentially, I'm speculating here, but you know, it feels like a potentially relevant speculation that as scientists look for planetary bodies and alien life out there, you know, what we expect that life to look like and be like is very much actually dependent on their ecology. And our ecology, in terms of our astronomy, maybe those planets are playing a part in the way that we look and behave here on planet Earth. And maybe those that energetic anatomy of those extraordinary, they call them extraordinary, superordinate to the way that the connections within the rest of the meridian system. And so that could be influenced by the planets. So meditating on each planet, whether you're doing the mantra or you're just staring at it in the sky and feeling the light, like every light of every constellation and every planet, every star has a feeling, a signature. So instead of looking at it and be like, oh yeah, Mars is red, that's cool. That's intellectual, you know? But what if you could just let the light hit your eyes and feel like you can trace it and ask yourself, well, what does that feel like in my body and in my consciousness? And you can't, it's not necessarily going to be a verbal experience, a verbal account. You can't, has a hint of tobacco and a hint of blackberry and like you're tasting a wine, you know, it's that could take years to develop if you ever even do, but just feeling it and letting it be a mystery, you know? So that's kind of my ad hoc account of recollection of that, which feels like a lifetime ago, to be honest, but it was powerful. And it's, mantra is an amazing practice, you know, for anyone who feels drawn to it. It can teach you a lot about the power of consciousness and the power of recognizing things that you could never even imagine. A mantra is like someone gives you a code, like here's a script, execute this code. And you would have never thought that you could ever feel that way. But the mantra created like a etheric or a virtual bodily experience for you. And then you realize, damn, you know, like this physical body is a mantra of its own, or a collection of mantras that became morphogenetically three-dimensional. But we're really this composite. The consciousness is so much more vast, and, you know, we have so much to learn. It's beautiful. I think that's why I've dedicated so much energy and attention to this.
Yeah, I've been experimenting with just having awareness and alignment with planets, just to do with their days, Monday, moon, so on.
Right. Yeah.
So I was curious if you'd notice a difference on Saturdays with Saturn and things like that as well, when you were doing that, if it was more intense on those days, or if you pay attention to the alignment of where that planet was according to the others when you did multiple ones on a day, of if you could feel more tension if those planets were in conflict at that moment, or more bliss and ease if they were actually aligned at that time.
Right. That's a great question. You know, when I decided to do the 200,000, kind of committed that I was going to and focus on just like the world of my commitment to it and see what would arise from that. And at that point, I was more experimenting with like, okay, what happens if I do the Saturn mantra and then I do the Jupiter one after? And what if I do both at the same time, which is, you know, kind of a cool advanced practice where you can layer mantras, but that requires that you can keep them running in the background and feel them, not just in your mind, because then that gets like a, you know, like it's like having 5.1 channel surround, but everything's different. So you want it to be like embodied. But I didn't focus so much on have in other occasions focused on the day separately. So the approach I took to this is, there could be a lot of confirmation bias because we have the model that tells us, okay, Saturn is Saturday and the sun is Sunday and the moon is Moon Day and so on and so forth. So the way that I did it was, look, I'm not going to try to disprove the model and do Saturn and pretend that Saturday isn't the Saturn day and just traditionally, and instead I'll do Saturn on Tuesday, which is Mars Day, right? I didn't try to like actively disprove the model. And the reason I say that is because, like, you could say, oh, well, you know, you just tried it on Saturday. And of course you could say it felt more because maybe you were looking for that. The thing is that, like, I'm not interested in reinventing the wheel. Like, these sages and rishis and yogis invented that whole system already. Like, I'm not interested in creating a new way to rearrange the mantras according to the week. They have that down. Maybe it works in some sense, in some in one model, one way of looking at the world, it's resonant. That doesn't mean that the mantras that I did on other days didn't have, an effect or something like that. But it means to me that I'm not going to go try to like test it every single way to make sure that it's really true. It's like, I don't have time for that. Like, they figured it out. But having said that, I did start asking myself at one point, like kind of what you're talking about, because you get curious, right? Like what's Saturday, and it started feeling to me like Saturday wasn't appropriate. The way I feel on a Saturday, I could correlate it ritualistically. I can imbue it with that meaning, and it matches. It creates a match. So I think part of seeing that clearly, you have to kind of deconstruct what we've done as a society with the days of the week and stuff like that, and get back to nature to really feel the raw pre-civilizational energy of that, to see what the rishis meant when they thought it was assigned different days. But I went through a period where I focused more on doing, the mantras of the planets on particular days. And that's a great way of organizing it. So I'm really grateful that somebody else came up with that, thousands of years ago. So I played with that, and it made sense to me. And I thought, I'm just going to go with this whenever I feel like inspired to do the practice. I'll be like, yep, I want to do that Saturday. I'm going to focus on this. And then Monday I'll do the moon, so on and so forth. But incidentally, one of my favorite times to practice is eclipses, because eclipses tend to naturally bring you your central channel and be meditative and be still and harmonized, and go central. And usually because of that, the practices you do during an eclipse tend to magnify their effect. You could try it, you could do it by huge, between 100 and 1,000 times of the feeling and the effect. But when, I don't follow, for example, astrology very strongly, because a lot of the reports on astrology tend to be very influenced by people's mental perceptions, and the fact that astrology is a hobby for them, and they get into it and they maybe over-assign meaning. But I do get interested in what planets are active in certain ways sometimes. And so during those times, I've experimented with, okay, so if today it's, Saturn and Pluto, then let me do the mantras for those, and experiment with how that feels. And it usually feels good, and I like it. I figured that it's a huge time saver to work mantras in a prescriptive way. So if like there's an alignment, that's when you work that mantra or you work that thing, because if it's true, it'll probably be good. It'll probably help you. If it's not true, it's not going to hurt you. That's sort of the way that I look at it. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, meditation anyway doesn't harm you. It's not going to cause a problem. And even if you're just doing a mantra-based meditation and it's gibberish to you, it helps you get into that relaxed, altered state where you can just be anyway. So I've tried experimenting with the different feel of energy of mantra by creating my own gibberish ones, where I've created a mantra statement and I've broken up the syllables of it and mixed them around and made this gibberish statement from my intention. So it's kind of like a sound sigil in a sense.
Yeah.
And activated by saying it while I held that intention and created a bunch of them, and then come back later without being able to remember what it was, because now I've got a bunch of gibberish syllables that I mantraized. And so when I sat and was saying them, I could feel that energy of what intention I'd actually put in that. But consciously, I had no freaking clue what that was about, because I was picking a random one out of 20 gibberish statements that I had from months ago.
Right.
So there definitely is a connection with energy of an intention. And I haven't tried it by giving those statements to somebody else and seeing what they'd feel. But with that planetary alignment thing, got a couple of different models it could be. There could be that spirit model of you're connecting with that distant planet's influence, or you could just be connecting in with that intention that thousands of yogis have energized that statement within our collective consciousness for years as well.
Right. If you
Either
actually
way.
pick up a mantra from the internet, like if you go on YouTube and listen to a mantra and you kind of just go into it, and you don't first connect to your own sound generation experience, and you just kind of take the mantra and repeat it, you're sort of also, the mind is kind of, it's like a fishing net. You've gone out there and you've thrown a net. You've collected this mantra. You either read it on a website or you're picking up on it through a YouTube video of a chant. You're going to also pick up the vibe of that mantra and the vibe of those people and the people that were chanting, and also even the whole historical mandala of all the people that have ever chanted that mantra. So, I think it's really important to develop self-sovereignty in a spiritual path, like the capacity to experiment. And what you said about creating your own sound sigils illustrates that in one sense, from one angle, because you're connecting first with your own creative ability. And a lot of people will realize that that's the omega anyway. That's like the end point. You kind of want to realize that you are the sound generator at the end. And when you, not you as in like the personal you, but the you of the origin of consciousness, which you have an access point to, right? So if you can create your own sound sigils, that proves the point. And then you realize that, well, a lot of other people created their own sounds and did them all together for hundreds or thousands of years, and that became a ritual, and that's the intentional connection, and that works too if you want to do that too. So I believe we can learn from both from the practices that have been traditionally handed down, and also the things that you can self-generate. Some people might get a little lost when they think, well, where do I start to self-generate? How do I do that? So you start with something external first and connect to that power. But once, as you said, once you do that yourself, you kind of realize like what this is really made of. It's like this intentional energy. And the fact that you could pick up on the energy without remembering what you created kind of lends itself to that account of there's energy embedded in things. So there's one interesting topic that I want to mention, just because we're like really like flirting with it here. There's a really interesting concept that I think is really useful for the self-sovereign body-mind cultivator to be aware of as they just go through everyday life. The concept is called egregores. An egregore is basically a cultural mandala. It's a psychical aggregate of the energy of a group, of a person, of a belief system. And it's like layers. Think of it like just like a mandala. So when you look at like a Tibetan mandala or a Hindu mandala, let's go with a Tibetan one. You can actually see like little landscapes and deities and artifacts and little floating around in the mandala, and all that is kind of like a virtual castle that represents the culture and the energies as depicted by the beings and their actions and what they're holding in their hand of something. And that mandala will represent a particular focal point, a particular deity with their surrounding deities. But that mandala is a good, the mandala analogy or the metaphor is a good way of looking at the egregores. So every religion, every group has an egregore. So Christianity, Judaism, Islam has an egregore. It's basically the psychical constructs that are kind of hovering over every person that believes in that system. Scientism as an institution has an egregore. It's a psychical construction that of belief systems that are both very present and active, or just encrusted through the lineage that are there. They're just like old, people that carry their lineage with them, and it's like a train of all their ancestors and all the weight of them, or the history of a particular belief system. The other night, I went and saw jazz. It was big band jazz, the jazz that was around when the U.S. went to World War II. Like, you know, and it was the guy who presented it, his energetic field held the egregore of indulging in that music, focusing in on it. And he could, you felt like this guy was time transplanted out of that time. And a lot of those things you could say, well, it's just, they just look the part. No, but the way they move, the way they act, the way that they carry their voice, the way they talk and speak, it's not just mimicry and puppetry. These people, when you're around them, you feel that way. And it's not just like a ventriloquism, like a puppet. No, we're not, you know, we're sensitive beings. We can feel these things. So egregores are something that's ever present in when someone carries a belief system from one thing to another. In the spiritual community, there's a ton of egregores, and a lot of those have to do with just, you know, allegiance to gurus and you know, seeing India as the motherland and focusing on that. There's egregores associated with sanghas or spiritual groups. There, you know, so this is a really great thing for people to be aware of when they walk through life and see what kind of belief systems are influencing people when they're saying what they're saying, and seeing that people think they're operating freely from within themselves, but oftentimes they're just like voice boxing whatever the belief systems are. And sometimes it can be hard to break those down. And egregores, you know, we flow in and out of them all the time. When you go to a particular city, you're now in the egregore of Melbourne. You're in the egregore of Sydney, of Newcastle. And you can feel it. You know, when you're in Newcastle, you get that, you know, blue collar, historical, industrial, coal mining. It's around you. You know, there's this energy to the city. So I travel a lot, and I love feeling the vibe of every city. And a lot of it has to do with the land you're standing on that influences people quite a lot. And also just the events that have happened. If you go to a place like Berlin, that place was like an intersection of egregores, like, you know, the Eastern Soviet with the Western, the Nazis, and then even in modern with, you know, immigration and modern, you know, sort of like Germany and the geopolitics, that you could feel it. And it could be quite heavy sometimes. So then you can clear that out and you find ways of working with it. But that's been one of the I think one of the most fun things that I can imagine as a body-mind cultivator is going from place to place and feeling what humans have cultivated culturally, noetically, through their mind, what kind of information is floating around. And again, like, because I was sort of educated as a scientist in one sense, it's been kind of nice practice for me to think from both perspectives. So here, scientists hearing this might say, well, I mean, a lot of that is just the way people dress and the way people talk, and then you have these associations. There's nothing more than that. But remember, if you think about what is the volume of the brain, you're like, yeah, the brain is in the skull. That's an anatomical, medical piece of knowledge. It comes from that epistemology, that method of knowing, of measuring. But if you look at the volume of the mind, then you can start asking, well, what's the volume like of me paying attention to my state of feeling? And your state of feeling is this amorphous thing that isn't just visual. It's just the way you feel. And it goes beyond your body. When you start describing and you hold your hands out, and even gestures, emotional gestures kind of point to that. It's just part of our experience. So when you ask, what's the volume like? And it's not physical volume, it's not Newtonian, it's like a hyper geometric volume. It's like a etheric virtual volume. What's the volume of the part of the mind that is the Christian egregore, or the liberal egregore, or the conservative egregore, or so on and so forth? And each one has a feeling, and each one has a time space. And that time space is exactly the same as the time spaces you enter into a ritual when you worship a particular deity. You are just remembering the aggregates that inform a particular worldview and intentionally summoning them. Thing is, in modern society, we don't think about it as religious, but it is using that same capacity in the brain that religion always has. you're ritualistically summoning those beliefs as you wake up, even if you don't kneel, even if you don't look at an image on the wall. You are just plugging in. You wake up, you plug in, you read the Wall Street Journal, you plug into the stocks of the day, you're plugging into the psychical support system that keeps you working, that keeps you connected to your bread and butter, you know? So I find the concept of egregores fascinating, and it's just something you learn through experience and experimentation. Notice when you walk into and out of a bar, into and out of a place, a yoga studio, feel the energy around it. Notice how your body feels when you enter something. All those things are based in reality. Now, if you're very much in your head and you don't have a very embodied experience, like you don't work out, you don't know how to do yoga, you don't know what your body feels like, everything will feel mental. And so then we think, oh, it's mental constructions. But as soon as you start going back to your body and cultivating and gaining sensitivity and doing experiments with mantras or with yoga and interoceptively focusing on different parts of your body and learning how to identify feelings, the feeling of egregores and fields of energy around you start to become just as real as, you know, in terms of your experience, as just acknowledging that the sky is blue. You know, maybe it's sometimes hard to say to English what it means, like to actually say, oh, like, you know, the wine analogy, hints of blackberry, this and this and that, but you can still feel it. And that doesn't make it any less real. It's just about, you know, can you replicate this experience in yourself, and can other people sort of corroborate that? And that's the hardest part about this whole thing, is that when we want to make this all scientific in the end, to train our AIs to help us and understand consciousness better, is really finding a way to report this. But we can't really find a way to report it until we start cultivating and talking about it, you know, or at least playing with it energetically in groups and just sharing these experiences. So anyway, I could go on and on. It's a fascinating topic, but it's one of the cool things about getting into all this body mind stuff.
It is, yeah. With the jazz band you were talking about, I remember watching a video of Hendrix talking about, like, once he starts playing, he checks out. It's like something else takes over and plays. And I was having a discussion a couple of years ago with an Aboriginal elder, and they were talking about groggeries, of what they do when they do their dance thing. And most of their dances are of an animal. So there's an emu dance, a kangaroo dance, and all this sort of stuff. And he goes, we don't dance. Like, you're trained from young that you're connecting with it, and you're actually embodying the spirit of the kangaroo when you do the kangaroo. So they're not there anymore. Once that music starts, they're getting in a trance from the didgeridoo and whatever other thing they're playing of a percussion sort of thing to get it like a hollowed out log. And in that trance state, they're pulling the spirit in of that animal and letting that express through them.
Right. Yeah, that's another awesome example of the virtual bodies, right? And the transference of consciousness between, you know, kind of like experiences of one animal or one human or whatnot. And there's all these anecdotes and documented experiences of yogis doing that kind of thing, or people, shamans doing that kind of thing. It's so fascinating. Yeah, it goes super deep. I think I really have to thank my teachers, you know, for helping me with this. And at some point, you know, really, I think everyone is a teacher, because part of there's a great thing that happens when you focus and you have certain teachers that really provide deep knowledge, and who you're attracted to just depends on your constitution, you know, mental, emotional, psychological, karmic. But in a sense, everyone is like a crucible for the alchemy of body-mind cultivation, the egregores that they carry, their parents, the belief systems and karmas. You know, with with a sensitivity of body, mind, cultivation and perception, you can start looking at everything as just you can look at the energetic anatomy of people and just learn and just see how they do things and look at them interact and solve problems and just learn how they have done things based upon, how to manage their own shit show, their own karmic issues. And then you learn, you're like, okay, that's cool. And we're all in this together. But yeah, my teachers and CAP have been really helpful. It's like a combination of Qigong, and one thing that's really in that system that is really fantastic, I have to say, is that has helped me a lot. And I didn't really find it in many other places, is emotional cultivation. So basically amplifying emotional experiences. So the experience of confidence and of joy and love and relaxation and bliss and these kinds of things, and actually exaggerating them so you can get your nervous system to feel it, because these positive states amp up the nervous system in a way that helps you to conduct energy better and faster. Traditionally, in like Raja Yoga, which is what most yoga schools teach nowadays in Yoga 200, 500 hour, the Yoga Alliance type of stuff, is Raja Yoga or Patanjali's yoga. And it talks about just basically stopping the frequencies of the mind and morally tuning your life so that you can create the conditions for realizing stillness, like the Godhead, right? The stillness at the very center. But all these practices are very human, right? And everything that's rooted in human tradition has human factors. So when these traditions were done, Raja Yoga and even Raja styles of Tantra, they didn't teach emotional cultivation because they didn't want any of the pupils to go off and form their own charismatic cults. So if someone got too charismatic, and they could pull other people out and form their own cults. So for control, they left out that part of cultivation. Don't cultivate your deepest emotions yet. Just focus on stilling the mind. But if you still the mind enough and you start encountering your shadow material, things get very challenging because you haven't expanded enough into positive, expansive states to be able to manage that. It's like you haven't packed your bags for the trip. So emotional cultivation early on, yes, it could make you potentially grow your ego even more, but it does facilitate the process of rewiring the nervous system to increase a signal bandwidth. And then you can become, under the right intention, especially once you start opening up your heart, which happens as a part of this process. If you're using CAP, all the components to guide energy into the central channel, it won't just stick to the charisma of the first, second, and third chakra centers, which is, the whims of modern gurus of the past 100, 120 years do. They'll have a higher realization and people will follow the whims of their lower chakras, and that's how you get a cult, basically. But their lower chakras their lower centers aren't quite developed, integrated, or healed, right? So then actually getting the expansive emotions, channeling them up into being integrated along the axis, the neural axis, or just the energetic axis here, that will tremendously help to integrate the human being and to help process the ability to create virtual bodies, like the bliss bodies we were talking about, like, creating alternate experiences, emerging from the primordial consciousness, and also just buffering yourself to daily stress. If you're honestly connected to emotions within yourself that you don't need to experience a joyful event to feel joy. You can auto-generate these emotions. You can learn to do that. Then you have a super toolkit to buffer yourself against stressors in everyday life. So I'm really grateful for that in particular, especially because a part of my motivation to do yoga in the first place wasn't just, like I said earlier, the spiritual enthusiast is motivated in part by his or her karma, or their trauma, rather, right? So I wanted to actually, in a sense, seek the transcendent, but I was also dealing with parts of myself that were pretty heavy. So I experienced early on some kind of depressive tendencies, and the emotional cultivation was what really gave me the toolkit to say, okay, I'm in control. I don't need to wait for life to get good. I can make life good right now. So, and then realizing early on that I didn't have to go to the Himalayas to do certain spiritual practices. That has to do with realizing bliss and emptiness of consciousness at the root chakra, where our security and safety and approval concerns are basically emerging from. Once you realize that there's bliss and emptiness even there, that is also a construct, even if you haven't resolved all the stuff yet, that could profoundly aid in the kind of realizing that heaven is on earth. And that's one thing I like to say a lot, is that heaven is on earth. It's already here. This is it. Like, there's nowhere to really get to once you realize that all past, future, and parallel lives are just parallel, really, in the end. If you see time as like, if you've ever seen the movie Inception, you can see how time and space bend on themselves. If everything is a construct and you can bend and warp it, everything is parallel ultimately. And this here now is a prism for everything. So this is heaven. This is it, If you realize that, and you realize that this is a giant gift, and you realize you have to enjoy things and cultivate positive emotional states, and you might as well start healing, because, everyone around you gets better as a result of that. So I'm very much a fan of an integrated, complete as possible path, and while also really loving yourself and realizing that it's okay. Like, I'm doing the best I can, and I'm going to try to do the best I can given the circumstances, and keep looking for new creative ways to heal and solve the puzzles of life.
Yeah, it's a fantastic approach to have, rather than just have a negative dim view or a no thing space view, to integrate that joy, love, and happiness into your life, because why not?
You can have it all. That's kind of my philosophy, is I know I can have it all. Like, the divine is not something out there we need to get to. The divine, our journey as occluded, kind of, you could say, occluded beings in the beginning, so to speak, of finding our way through the darkness, is to figure out, how to get from the many, from duality to non-dual, from the many to the one, so to speak, that journey. But the divine's journey was to go from the one to the many, to not have dinner alone. So once you realize that the oneness, you taste it, and you get a peek of it, and you realize that it's already within you, then part of the journey is also to actually enjoy and expand into. That's what Tantra is really about. It's not about bedroom Tantra. That's just one tiny piece of Tantra. Tantra is about expanding and becoming everything the divine can possibly become. So this really is it. It's like a giant prism of all the possibility. And I believe, and I know that we can have it all. And believing that is very empowering. And I want to mention a cool little study about the power of belief, and some, what we owe to ourselves to believe in things that are helpful to our growth. So there was an experiment done where there was like an economic game, like something involving transactions and giving rewards to people that accomplish certain tasks, and like punishments, or like, removing money. It was like involving money, It was a scientific laboratory experiment. I can't remember the details of the economic game, but it was economic in nature. And they divided into two groups. One group that was told that they have free will in the way that they run the game and choose the game. They have free will. The other group played the exact same game, nothing changed, but they were told by the experimenter, you have no free will. The people that were told that they have no free will, the choices they made became less moral. And the people who were told they had free will, they naturally made more moral choices, or more ethical choices. So there's this big scientific debate right now about, And it's been going on forever, since the 20th century, if not way earlier than that, but formally in neuroscience since the mid 20th century. About, does free will exist? Does it not exist? We know that we're conditioned by our past. So if we break that down really, really finely, we're really conditioned, to this very moment, the kinds of things we would choose. But the thing is, so a lot of people have started to say, or at least I like to say in the neuroscience world, what I tell people is free will is a convenient illusion in one sense. It's like we think we're freer than we really are. But believing you're free makes you a better agent of the world you live in. And you get to serve your life and the people and things around you better. If you don't believe in free will, you will just naturally, just by hearing that and internalizing that belief, you risk living a life that is maybe that direction by what the even less like you'll exercise less agency over your own condition. It's like you can admit that we live in a bubble, perhaps of like a matrix of some sort, but of our own perceptions and what we think is real and what may or may not be real and all that, and our own cognitive biases. But we have to learn to work with them. If we believe that we're free, we'll act more freely than if we believe otherwise. So I when I say something like, I believe I can have it all, or that we can all have it all. And I don't mean that in like a greedy way, but like in a really plentiful, like from the heart space, like, yes, we can all do this together. We all have each other. We've all been each other in some parallel reality or not, or otherwise. We can all empathize with each other and imagine what it would be like to be in somebody else's shoes. We can also heal and expand at the same time. We can do as much as we feel we want to and find the divine in everything. So believing something that is abundant in its very nature, I feel it can only lead to good things if you're taking an integrated path. If you just run around saying that, like, it just becomes new age. Like, I am God. I realize that I'm God, so I'm God. So let me just do what I want, and I'm perfect the way I am, right? So I don't have to do any work. No, it's not like that either. So that's part of what drives me is the belief that divinity is omniscient, omnipresent, and omnipotent, and there's no limitation. And anything that has some limit is just our idea of what the divine is. Really, what is divine is ultimate. Starts off as something out there, right? Because we're like, we want to run away from our trauma and find out the light that's out there in front of us. But then it's this receding horizon. We're like, oh shit, enlightenment doesn't exist. It's just a carrot tied to my own head, and is very much dependent on someone's own ideology and what kind of enlightenment, and enlightenment of what skill. Can you be an enlightened mantra reciter? Yes. Or can you be an enlightened yogi that realizes something very specific about reality? Yes. But you go from all that stuff chasing to kind of just enjoying what's here and making that your superpower, of what you're good at, and having everything. So that's the journey I think we're on, and I like to stay positive about it, because every positive thing that we have is something extra to pack our bags with when we go and deal with our shadow, and and go into hypnosis to deal with the stuff that's difficult, and things like that. So yeah.
That's fantastic. Now, if people have enjoyed this and they want to see where your path is going in the future and follow your work onwards, where can they go to find more out about that?
I think the best place is just my website. Really is neuralaxis.org or just gabrielaxel.com. Gabrielaxel.com. That's where I park everything, and that's where I put updates regarding courses, forms that people can express their interest in taking CAP, or neural active framework, things like that. I'll be coming out with a mantra course at some point in the future, and basically email lists. I don't send a lot of updates. They're very pertinent updates. So if people want to keep track of when major things are happening, email list is a better way to do it, even in our social media age. So I like to keep it focused, because the more I focus on delivering value with specific offerings, the more I can focus on those things, and also on cultivation and family life, rather than being too crazy to post on social media little bits and pieces to keep people's attention away from their own cultivation. So yeah, please, my website, gabrielaxel.com, email list, that's the best way.
Fantastic. It's been a pleasure having you on. I look forward to finding out more about the mantra course when it comes available.
Cool. Thanks, Lance, for having me. It's been a real pleasure to talk and to share about the journey that still very much we're all in together and ongoing. So, I look forward to having a chat with you another time.
Excellent.
Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed this episode and perhaps learned something new. If you did, I'd love for you to subscribe or drop a review on whatever favorite podcast you have, or if you've been enjoying the video versions on YouTube or Facebook, do it there. If something really did click home for you with this episode, perhaps it could benefit one of your friends or family. If so, it'd really help if you shared this on your social medias. Until next time, you've been listening to Akasha Talks with Lance Baker.